think the other statement Cisco produced was 25 billion devices connected to the internet by 2015 and 50 billion by 2020. How many people in the world today? 7 billion. 7 billion people. So 4 devices for each person. Is that real? How many of you guys already have 3 or 4 devices that's connected, right? I got the phone, I got my tablet, I got, I got my computer, right? So very realistic, very, very realistic. And technically this problem is not one of the future, it's a problem of today. All right. And I think that Joshua and Danielle will also speak to that. And then what I'm going to try and do is break down the market a little bit of the $23.3 billion of the market in 2016. And we talk about how we segment this market. And so I'll cover this now. And so as you can see, we kind of segmented the market through the top here by hardware, network, software, applications, professional services. Then what we did in this study was we looked at the main roles of the main function of each of those delivery mechanisms, the sample players, and the future market size. And what you quickly realize is that the largest environment at almost 60% is the applications itself, and the app development, data collection, implementation and such. Now, the interesting part about this on the Internet of Things is I'll build this, is that if you want to own these delivery areas, you really got to start in the hardware section. And that's what my talk will be about today. See, in the Internet of Things, there's a lot of unknowns that go on. And as this proliferation of 50 billion devices do come out, well, who makes those devices? Who's trusted? Who's not trusted? We want to encourage development. But if Alex here, for example, comes up with a great idea and decides to put that on our network, how do we know he's a trusted person that doesn't tear down the network? How do we know that the data that he's collecting is secure? Maybe he's coming out with a biometric device, for example, that collects heart rates and everything about the individual, and you want to pass that information on to the health service provider, which is fine. You can do that all across the internet today. It's very popular, very common. Well, how do we know the device that he made is really secure? Because a hacker could easily come penetrate that device and now take over that device, collect that information. And that's the fear and uncertainty and doubt that's out there. That's what we're trying to overcome, is to ensure not only through the current security methodologies that we know of today, but also enable, Alex, the tools and the hardware to manufacture a secure device that is trusted on a network like Sprint. So what you find, again, is that all these application providers are out here creating stuff, but look how small the market and development is in hardware. And that's the awareness we're trying to bring out. Some of the devices and mobile devices that are out today, many of them in your pockets, already have this type of security in place. You just don't know it, and we don't use it. Two points. So how do we break that down? We look at the 4 quadrants, from application, services, network, and devices. And we also look at pretty much the different types of devices that are out there. Based on the device, every device like a smartphone, for example, will have application, services, network, and different types of devices in that space. In the connected devices, same thing. Broadband connectivity, same thing. What is interesting also is that we also focus and kind of focus the big picture on what we call augmented reality. That is taking reality and augmenting it, like in gaming or in virtual reality games and such. Whereas there's also something called reality augmented. And that's where we find where we have adaptive systems, healthcare applications, and accumulated environment. When your phone has, I forget the term, but basically when it vibrates back at you, so that you know that the input was taken or that somebody's alerting you and such. And so we take basically reality right? And we present it to you in a way that's going to enhance it now, versus taking reality and changing it into something else. But both are very valid, and both have really applications that ride on the network. And so the big picture is, not only these devices will do both of those things, like I think Xbox One coming out, everybody's hanging out at Best Buy, they have 5 this morning, so that's all gone now. But that's kind of the augmented reality. Whereas reality augmented is as we have more biometrics and things that come to reality, and collecting of that information of real stuff. So what it really does is it requires what we call a trusted network. So these chips that are in your phones today, microprocessors, like a company called ARM builds, I don't know if you guys ever heard of ARM, but one of the largest microprocessor chip creators out there. And them together with a couple other vendors came out and created a company called Trustonic. You can write that name down. It really is taking the chip, and in ARM's chip, what they actually do is they come out with 2 sections of the chip. They come out with a public side, basically, and a secure side. And then in the middle of that, they have a process to which manages information between the public side and the private side. And without getting too technical, I'll give you a very straightforward example. Keystrokes on a smartphone. So currently, most of the keystrokes that we use on our smartphone are public. They're unencrypted. There's no security behind that keystroke. So if somebody really wanted to grab that keystroke, it's fairly easy off of a smartphone. Very simple to do. Well, at the core of it, if you think about it, it's hardware. It's hardware input. So if you can then take the keyboard and say, okay, wait now, this person is going to do a financial transaction. They launch a financial application. That now we collect that keyboard information, but put it only on the secure side of the chip. Right? Encrypted, it has authentication. Now, how do we know that that's a trusted chip in the system? Is there's also a service provider, an outside organization, that can authenticate that that chip is real. And it's supposed to be on the network. The network providers, the Verizon, Sprint, AT&Ts, right, will then depend on that third-party company to say, hey, is this a real device that's supposed to is fully trusted to be on that network? And that's the most simple, crass way I can explain it. But we have it already in place, and we do it on some smartphones already, some of the later ones. It's not on every smartphone today, and it's definitely not on every tablet or everything else in which you do financial transactions on today, and collect health information on and such. So we expect this development to start to continue a little more aggressively. We've had it for 3 years. So we'll probably, as the proliferation of the machine-to-machine devices do come out, then it'll start to get more aggressive in the next 2 years. We'll probably see a lot more proliferation of this type of model. There's other ways to address it and other means, as security experts in the room know, that other people look at, whether you do